This Saturday afternoon at 2:30 p.m. Central Time, we have a Big Ten football matchup on the Big Ten Network between the 5-5, 3-4 in Big Ten play Wisconsin Badgers and the 5-5, 2-5 in Big Ten Conference play Nebraska Cornhuskers. Nebraska opened up this game as a 2-point favorite. So basically, what Vegas is telling you is that these two teams are dead even on a neutral field. That makes sense. Both of their offensive coordinators to begin the season have been fired. Both of their star quarterbacks are either dead in the sense of college football because Tyler Van Dyke is out for the season with an injury, or broken in the case of Dylan Raiola and his production declining game over game over game. And both of these fan bases have a little bit of discontentment. So these teams are in very similar situations. The reason why Nebraska opened up as a 2-point favorite is pretty simple. They're at home. This game is taking place in Memorial Stadium in Lincoln, Nebraska, and the line's moved up by a half point. So Nebraska right now, -2.5, hosting the Wisconsin Badgers, who are actually favored to win this game per ESPN's FPI. Wisconsin is given a 53% chance to win per the computers. This is a massive game for both teams because a win here and someone goes bowling. And I think Wisconsin, because of how tough their schedule is and how Luke Fickell's only in year 2, and he did not take over a very good program from Paul Chryst. He didn't. And Nebraska, because they haven't been to a bowl game since 2016, even though they've had an easier schedule this season than Wisconsin has, going to a bowl game would be a success, in my mind, for both of these teams. The loser of this game, though, is still searching for a bowl game, and they do not have easy tasks the following weekend either. Wisconsin plays Minnesota. Thankfully for them, that game is at home. Nebraska has to travel on the road to play Iowa, so good luck with that. But we're talking about Wisconsin and Nebraska this coming Saturday, and I'm going to give you my preview, my analysis, and prediction. But before we do that, I ask you to do some favors for the channel, to score a touchdown for college football with Sam. Think of it as scoring a touchdown for your own team, as the more you support college football with Sam, the more you're engaged, the more teams that I can cover, the more that I can do for you. It's a mutual beneficiary thing we have going on here, a mutual benefiting relationship. A symbiotic relationship, maybe is the best way to put it. And that is subscribing to the channel, hitting the like button, clicking the notification bell, commenting your prediction down below, sharing this video around, and joining our Discord server via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment, whichever is the easiest for you. Probably the pinned comment is the easiest to navigate. Click that link, and you'll be in our Discord server. We talk college football 24/7. And if you want to support the channel monetarily, if you want to kick the extra point in addition to scoring the touchdown, it's not necessary, but if you want to do it, the way to do that is to super chat via the comment section or sign up as a paid member of our Patreon page. Link is in the description or down below in the pinned comment. Or you can purchase merchandise via my merchandise store. The link to that, again, in the description or down below in the pinned comment. But let's get to this game right now because there's so much to talk about. And of course, we don't have all day to talk about it. And these teams don't have all day to play each other either. These are two teams that may say in some instances, although I think this is more the case with Nebraska than Wisconsin. Wisconsin is a team that in their losses has typically been on the losing end of momentum at the final 60-minute mark, at the moment when the clock hits 0, leading Penn State, leading Oregon, actually leading Alabama at one point, as surprising as that sounds, though it was very brief, competing with Iowa, leading USC at the half, and then losing all those games in the second half. Nebraska is a team that has gotten blitzed right out of the gate in multiple of their losses. To name mainly UCLA, 27-7 at one point. Indiana, a game where they never really came back. And then Ohio State, that was kind of that way too, 14-6 at the half. And final score was 21-17. Technically, Nebraska gained on Ohio State in that second half. And at one point, it felt like Nebraska might actually pull off that upset. These are two teams that I think the fan bases feel like if they just had whether it's a little more time for Nebraska, or maybe if Tyler Van Dyke doesn't get hurt, or Wisconsin, I don't know, lands a better transfer or two. And you could say the same for Nebraska, that these teams would be in different positions. They are very close and yet very, very far. Wisconsin is viewed as 7.6 points, better than the average college football team per FPI, 5.2 points better than the average college football team per S&P Plus, and 4.8 points better than the average college football team, or the average Power 4 team per potential power index, as the potential power index does not yet rank or rate group of 5 teams. For Nebraska, they're viewed as 4.4 points better than the average college football team per FPI, 4 points better than the average team in SP+, and they're viewed as 1.3 points worse than the average Power 4 team in potential power. And potential power, that's my own power ratings. That's a little bit of my opinion sprinkled on top of a lot of objective data, rating sources from other sites, etc. And then FPI is a pure computer machine that I think has a ton of input from a ton of different people. And S&P Plus is Bill Connolly's computerized power ratings. Hopefully, the potential power index can one day be as good, if not greater, than those other two, but it's a work in progress and something that I'm introducing and tracking as the season goes on. You look at the points per play margin for both of these teams, and even the expected points added margin, well, they're kind of like the Spider-Man meme pointing at each other, where Wisconsin is just barely above breaking even in points per play margin. A 0.001 points per play margin means that for every one of Wisconsin's plays compared to every one of their opponents' plays, average opponents' plays, they score 1/1000th of a point more. Basically dead even. In a summary, Wisconsin, when facing up against their average opponent, neither wins nor loses the battle on a play-per-play basis. They've blown out some teams. They've been blown at other times. They've won close games. They've lost close games. You look at Nebraska, the story's a little bit different. They have a negative 0.036 points per play margin. That means on an average basis, Nebraska's opponents outscore them slightly more per play compared to how much Nebraska scores on a given play. And yet Nebraska has a higher expected points added margin, 0.073, compared to Wisconsin's 0.056, which makes sense if you watch both of these teams. Nebraska has the more potent offense overall, but Wisconsin is much more effective with the talent it has on offense than Nebraska is. And what expected points added margin is how is your offense performing on how they're driving down the field? How does your defense perform in stopping opponents from driving down your field? Because expected points added is not how much points you actually score, it's how much points you're expected to score given on your field position on any given down, on any given play. So what Nebraska's doing actually makes sense in the expected points added margin, and I don't have all day to explain this, but Wisconsin, just watching, I guess, watching how the two teams operate, Wisconsin's scrappier. They're more effective even if they're put in inferior positions. And Nebraska's more likely to fumble away the game than Wisconsin is. So that's why you see the differences there, which is a little bit strange. The strength of schedules couldn't be more identical. Wisconsin's 15th, Nebraska's 14th. Wisconsin is 21st in game control. Nebraska's 37th. And I think the game control being in Wisconsin's favor is another example of how they're a scrappier team than Nebraska is. I mean, Wisconsin played Penn State close for 3 quarters, Oregon close for 4. I imagine they could have done something similar to Ohio State that Nebraska did. And Nebraska, they played OSU close, but they got torched by Indiana. They were torched by UCLA for a few quarters. When watching the UCLA game outside of the one play on the pick six, I thought it was pretty clear that USC was the better team. They're 43rd in efficiency compared to Wisconsin's 42nd. So again, these teams are very, very similar. Power ratings slightly bend to Wisconsin, but only by a little bit that I think home field advantage understandably would make up for, because Memorial Stadium is a loud environment. It's a big environment. And home field advantage matters in college football, especially. In the NFL, it can. If the team's doing well, it can be a factor. But in college football, especially, those environments are just different. It's what you love about the sport so much. The critical matchup between the Badgers and the Cornhuskers is all about Wisconsin's rushing game. I don't care if Nebraska can't run the football. I frankly don't care. I don't care if they run for negative 0.1 yards per carry. I don't. If Wisconsin can't run for more than, I don't know, 3 yards per carry, maybe 2.5 or 2 if my extreme analogy is used, but that's very unlikely unless Nebraska, their offensive line totally breaks and a rushing defense from Wisconsin that's been mediocre all year just plays its best game. But if Wisconsin can't run for 3.5, more likely 4.5 yards per carry here, there are going to be some issues, I would say, because Nebraska, they do have the higher upside at quarterback, the higher upside, I think, at wide receiver, at tight end for sure. And they're at home. And what is the best way to neutralize the crowd and to really demoralize the defense? And this is a Nebraska defense that if you lean on them for long enough, if you kind of win the TOP battle, or maybe not win the TOP battle, but you're able to move them consistently, they'll get a little frustrated. They'll begin to break down a little bit. And if you're Wisconsin, how you bring that about is you run the ball. Your offensive line comes to play. Your running back, Tawi Walker, who's been awesome this year, he comes to play. Wisconsin's rushing offense, they average 4.7 yards per carry, which was 44th. They have 174 rushing yards per game on average, which is 49th. And they're 46th in rushing attempts per game, averaging 37.3. Nebraska, they average 36.1 rushing attempts per game, but they only gain 122.8 rushing yards per game, and they average 3.4 yards per attempt. That 3.4 yards per attempt is a woeful 111th, and it's not like they faced a bunch of world-beating rushing defenses either. USC's above average, sometimes mediocre, sometimes good. UCLA's is actually pretty good. Ohio State's is very good. Indiana's is too. But they had issues before those games at running the ball. And actually, their game against Ohio State was one of their better games when you look at relative performance and how Nebraska ran the football against the Buckeyes. They have had issues they couldn't run on Rutgers' rushing defense. And Rutgers, for a while, had a rushing defense that was outside of the top 100. Still may be. I just haven't checked on them yet. We'll do so tomorrow when I preview Rutgers versus Illinois. You sometimes get a lot of these teams confused. They're red, they're from the Big Ten, and they're not bad, they're not terrible, but they're not really that good either. That's been the story of a lot of these teams in the Big Ten, a lot of the middle of the pack teams. Indiana, Oregon, Penn State, Ohio State. They're all at the top. The rest of the conference outside of Purdue, who's the bottom feeder this year, is kind of in that middle and can fluctuate at any moment. Maryland and Northwestern are probably closer to the bottom. I'd say Nebraska, Wisconsin, Rutgers are more so toward the median, the mean. Depending on how they finish out the year, they could maybe be a little bit above average. But anyway, to get back to the point, Nebraska's not had much success running the ball. And despite the fact that Wisconsin, when you look at Wisconsin's rushing defense, they're 96th in yards per carry, allowing 4.8. They allow 169.8 rushing yards per game, 88th. Nebraska, meanwhile, only allow 98.3 rushing yards per game, 8th. 3.3 yards per carry, 14th. And they allow 3.3 less rushing first downs per game than Wisconsin does. I don't think there's that disparity in truth in rushing defense between these two schools. I don't. And maybe that's me being ignorant by not ignoring that statistic, but minimizing it. But I was impressed with what Wisconsin did against Oregon in stopping the run for parts of that game. Same with what they did against Penn State. Iowa, I'm just going to tell you, Iowa's Iowa, with how highly that offensive line is graded. Sullivan, it sounds like he's out for the rest of the year, so I don't think they'll have the same high-octane rushing offense that they did when he was briefly quarterback. But when he was healthy and when he was quarterback and they ran him and then Caleb Johnson with the outside zone, you could not stop that rushing offense. You couldn't, unless you were an elite rushing defense and you also had a solid pass defense to make sure that while Iowa's wide receivers and tight ends are not good, that they couldn't occasionally burn you. But this is ultimately the critical matchup here, because Nebraska, if you're to take these stats at face value, actually has the better rushing game. Wisconsin is the better rushing offense, yes, but Nebraska is the far superior rushing defense. And when averaging rushing offense and rushing defense, you'd rather have what Nebraska has there than what Wisconsin does. So Wisconsin needs to outperform what their statistics say they'll do in both run offense and run defense. But I think run offense is most important because Nebraska struggled to run on just about everyone they have. And Wisconsin, meanwhile, has shown that they can run on Penn State. They've shown that they can run on Oregon. Can they bring their ceiling in rush offense to this game? If they can, I think they can establish a bit of game control, especially with the fact that they just fired their offensive coordinator. They haven't had 2 weeks like Nebraska has with Dana Holgorsen to really put together a new game plan. Nebraska hiring Holgorsen sort of felt like they were trying to save the season. Wisconsin, a part of me feels like that firing maybe was them pulling the plug on the season entirely. I don't know if that's true. I think, of course, they want to win, but we'll just have to see how this game plays out. It's going to be very fascinating. I think Wisconsin's better at running back. I do lean Wisconsin at wide receiver too. I'm not going to lie. It's the same thing with the entire offensive line. But Nebraska, I'd take in a heartbeat at quarterback. I think they're way better at quarterback, even with some of the limitations Raiola has. And I also think they're way better at tight end. So in general, these offenses are pretty close together. I think that Tawi Walker this year has been good. He's been great. Wisconsin does not have a lot of weapons on offense, so to see Walker have 773 rushing yards for 4.8 yards per carry and 10 rushing touchdowns, I think is impressive. Katie Akamelli and Darian Dupree are other active running backs who have at least 200 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown or two. Braden Locke is this team's quarterback right now with 1,514 passing yards. He completes 55.1% of his throws. 1-to-1 TD-INT ratio with 9 touchdowns and 9 interceptions. He only averages 6.5 yards per attempt, and he has a QBR of 45.5, almost outside of the top 100 at 95th. Wisconsin only averages 11.2 yards per reception, but that is not that far off from Nebraska, who only averages 10.5 yards per reception, if that's believable. Raiola, he averages right now 6.9 yards per attempt, or 6.8 rather. He has 11 touchdowns, 10 interceptions, 2,112 yards, completes 65.5% of his throws, and he has a QBR of 57.1, which is 73rd. His QBR has been getting worse every week. That's not an exaggeration, by the way. It's been getting worse and worse and worse. It's been declining every week. And Nebraska's leading rusher in Dante Dowdle, he does not even have 700 rushing yards, doesn't even have 600. He has 523 for 4.4 yards per carry and 8 rushing touchdowns. Emmett Johnson, Ramir Johnson, and wide receiver Ja'Cory Barney Jr. are other players with at least 100 rushing yards or more. And Barney has 3 rushing touchdowns and is used on outside runs on wide receiver end-arounds or pop passes at times to get in the end zone or to keep teams honest on the defensive side of the ball on the outside toward the perimeter. Those are the offenses right there. The quarterback play, the running back play, the how far are you at attacking downfield with the pass. Nebraska's Isaiah Nair and Jamal Banks and Ja'Cory Barney Jr. all have at least 300 receiving yards or more. Nair has 426, Banks has 415. Nair has 5 touchdowns, Banks has 2. Fedoni, the tight end, has 30 receptions, where he is 3rd on the team, and he has 298 receiving yards. No receiving touchdowns yet, though. Jalen Lloyd, Ramir Johnson, and Emmett Johnson are other players that have at least 100 receiving yards or more. You look at Wisconsin, Vinny Anthony II has 2 receiving touchdowns. Same with C.J. Williams and Trech Kahuna. Will Pauling has 3 receiving touchdowns for 407 receiving yards. And he has 42 receptions, where he leads the team by a mile in that category. I think when both of these receiver rooms are healthy, Wisconsin's is a little better. I think Wisconsin is better at pass blocking and better at run blocking. I think that their individual running back, like when you look at the best running back from each team, the starter, is better. In terms of depth, I'd slightly prefer Nebraska at depth here, but I would strongly prefer Tawi Walker as my starter compared to Dante Dowdle. I think that Walker runs with a lot of power, with a lot of anger, force. I really like what he has done with Wisconsin this year. He's really carried their offense, if we're being honest. And you look at sack rate here, Wisconsin, 2.75 sack percentage. That's 11th. They only allow 0.9 sacks per game. 8th. It's been the only reason why Braden Locke doesn't have a QBR of the equivalent of Spencer Petras, because Wisconsin quietly has one of the Big Ten's better offensive lines. Nebraska, meanwhile, has a 6.94 sack percentage, which is 89th, and they allow 2.5 sacks per game, which is 96th. So there's a big mismatch there in pass protection on the O-line, and Wisconsin blocks better up front in running the football than Nebraska does. So Nebraska, I think, is a huge disadvantage at the O-line, big advantage at QB and tight end. Running back and wide receiver are areas that could be negotiated in favor of Nebraska, but I'll take Wisconsin in those areas for now. You look defensively, I would take Nebraska's front, but I would take Wisconsin's secondary. And you see that statistically, where we already talked about these 2 rushing defenses, so we don't need to go over that a second time, but Nebraska's top 10 in rushing attempts per game, yards per game, and first downs per game, top 15 in yards per carry allowed. Wisconsin's outside the top 50 in all of those. But you look at pass defense, and Wisconsin only allows their opponents to average 6.4 yards per pass attempt, 33rd. They held Dylan Gabriel to 0 passing touchdowns, the first game all season where he has not thrown a passing touchdown. They only allow their opponents to average 10.7 yards per completion, which is 24th. Nebraska allows their opponents to average 7.5 pass yards per attempt and 11.5 yards per pass completion. And this is being done while Nebraska has a top 15 sack percentage and they're top 20 in sacks per game. Wisconsin's outside the top 90 in both of those categories. So Wisconsin, compared to Nebraska, doesn't have a pass rush, and yet Wisconsin is that much more successful at defending the pass. That's thanks to players like Hunter Wohler, Ricardo Hallman, for example. Wisconsin is top 10 in opponent passing first downs per game, and they only allow opponents to average 164.5 passing yards per game, top 10, compared to Nebraska, who's outside the top 50 in those. Now, Wisconsin, they do average nearly 3 fewer opponent pass attempts per game because teams like to run on Wisconsin because they can run on Wisconsin. It's harder to run on Nebraska. But even factoring that in, Wisconsin holds their opponents to complete 60% of their throws. Nebraska holds opponents to complete nearly 2 out of every 3 of their passes. Nebraska, again, they have the better sack percentage, and yet even when quarterbacks who are facing Nebraska are under more pressure, they have more success against Nebraska and their DBs than they do against a Wisconsin defensive back core that doesn't get all that much help from its defensive line up front. Nash Hutmacher, Ty Robinson, Jamari Butler, you got John Bullock at linebacker 2 for the Huskers, James Williams, who's been a good rotational player. I would take, you also got to think about Bayer, Cameron Lenhart. I would take them over Wisconsin because whether it's, Kurt Neal or Ben Barton, they really don't have that good of a front. The 2-4-5, the 3-3-5 that they run. I wonder if they're going to stick with that at Wisconsin, or if that's just a temporary thing because they don't have a lot of good defensive linemen. Christian Allegro, John Pius, Sebastian Cheeks, Jake Chaney, Leon Lowry Jr. I do think they're comparable to MJ Sherman, John Bullock, McGahee the fourth. You look at Bayer, Princewell, Unman Malin, but I would take Nebraska's linebacker core over Wisconsin's. Not by a ton. It's not a push either, though. I would still lean Nebraska there. But at secondary, Ricardo Holman, who he has 4 passes defended, 4 querying, has 5 passes defended and a pick. Wohler has 6 passes defended. And I already read you the analytics. We don't need to go further than that since the strength of schedules are comparable. Wisconsin faced a great passing offense in Oregon. Yes, they're dealing with injuries, but Ohio State was dealing with injuries when they played Nebraska. Josh Simmons. And missing your left tackle is pretty darn important when it comes to protecting the quarterback, and Ohio State still had a decent amount of success through the air. So I would take Wisconsin's DB core over Nebraska's, which features players like Marcus Buford Jr., C.R. Wright, who's done awesome this year, Malcolm Hartzog Jr., Deshaun Singleton, Tommy Hill, Isaac Gifford. On the season, in total, Nebraska has 26 sacks, 32 passes defended, 10 interceptions, and 5 forced fumbles. Wisconsin has 16 sacks, 30 passes defended, 4 forced fumbles, and 4 interceptions and 3 fumble recoveries. On defense, I don't know. I think I would slightly lean Nebraska on defense. Not by a huge margin, though. Offensively, I honestly couldn't tell you who I would favor on offense. Both are so bad and so inept in their own different ways. Wisconsin is more disciplined, by the way. They're top 30 in penalties per game, penalty yards per game, penalty first downs per game. Nebraska's outside the top 90 in all of those. So in a close game like this, that's something to pay attention to. Nebraska is likely to win the turnover battle, though. They give up fewer turnovers, for example. But you look at scoring defense here. Nebraska barely leads Wisconsin. They're both top 40, both outside the top 25. Wisconsin allows opponents to score 0.359 points per play. Nebraska allows opponents to score 0.345, both outside the top 40. And Wisconsin only allows opponents to average 0.3 more yards per play compared to Nebraska. Wisconsin's slightly better on offense. That's kind of what I expected. So these teams are pretty dead even. As I said at the beginning of the video, I'd probably take Wisconsin slightly more on offense. Would have been more confident in that before Longo was fired, but he's been fired now, so I don't know. And I'd probably take Nebraska defensively, like roster-wise. Wisconsin offense, Nebraska defense. I do think that Wisconsin is stronger in the trenches because I think their offensive line, performance-wise, is so much further ahead of Nebraska's O-line performance-wise compared to how far ahead Nebraska's D-line is over Wisconsin's D-line. This could be an area where they break even, but despite all the talent Nebraska has on the D-line, I don't think they've performed quite to that level. Maybe it's because of the linebackers, maybe it's because of the defensive backs, but there are games where they are pushed around from the get-go, and it doesn't take time to wear them down like maybe Ohio State's defensive line or Penn State's or Michigan's. It's not quite there yet. Now, Wisconsin on the offensive line, they're not perfect either, but they do a very good job at protecting their quarterback. They do the best they can to open up lanes in the ground game. I would take Wisconsin in the trenches overall, but it's very close, and they're very bipolar in the trenches. Nebraska's all defense in the trenches, no offense. It's the inverse for the Badgers here. On special teams, I would take Wisconsin. They've had a more trustworthy kicker throughout the year. They have had a better return game, and they don't allow field goals to be blocked or miss their extra points. So I'd go with the Badgers on special teams. In coaching, I do think Fickell's a better head coach than Matt Rule. I think he comes up with better game plans. I think he's a better game manager. And that's really what I care about when talking about the coaching edge in matchups that I discuss. I do think Wisconsin is the edge at head coach. I think Wisconsin's better conditioned. I really do think that way. Just watch how they play against the top opponents that they've played this season, especially in Big Ten play. because they had to really settle themselves after that Alabama game. And I think that with the limitations they have on the defensive line, the way they stepped up against Penn State and Oregon was impressive. The way where they had that mid-season run in October, it was against bad competition, yes, but they still were dominant in those games. I think they have fight, and I think that Wisconsin players outside of really that quarterback position, where they've relied on transfers and it just hasn't worked out, is fairly well developed, I would say. You look at Nebraska, meanwhile, they're better developed than they were under Frost, and I think they're well developed in a lot of areas, but I do think Wisconsin barely outclasses them there. And I would actually take Mike Tressel as a defensive coordinator over Tony White. But what I will say is I'd rather be Nebraska's offensive staff right now. I'd rather take theirs in a heartbeat, because Wisconsin basically is running their tight ends coach as their offensive coordinator, and I would rather take Dana Holgerson over a Wisconsin tight ends coach who has managed some of the worst Wisconsin tight end rooms that we've seen in quite some time. Coaching edge overall goes to Wisconsin, but Nebraska does have some advantages here in the home field advantage. Regardless of that, though, I'm picking Wisconsin here. My model has Wisconsin minus 3.1, and my pick is that they cover and win because I think that in a close game like this, whoever's going to be the more physical team, whoever is going to be the more disciplined, who will have the better special teams, and who will have that man who can make those quick, instant decisions, who can come up with a good game plan on the fly, is going to be important. And you need that guy at CEO. And I think Fickle is more proven and better than Rule in situations like this. Special teams goes Wisconsin's way. I think physicality slightly leans Wisconsin. And yeah, I think they're the slightly better team, and they're not as penalized either. Nebraska commits a ton of penalties. They always self-sabotage, and it's not just the opposing referees. In Nebraska, I say that because they have gotten, I think, the short end of the stick on a lot of calls, but that's not what always happens. There are times where that happens, but then for a lot of the game, they're shooting themselves in the foot. Wisconsin doesn't do that. That's part of the reason why Wisconsin, despite having worse positions at different points, we talked about with the expected points added margin, where Wisconsin, with how they run their offense and defense and how like the field position at different times of the game or where they are on the field for every play, they're not expected to score as many points as Nebraska is, but when it comes down to it in actuality, they do score more points because it's not like you're at the 25, 1st and 10, and Nebraska gets a false start. That moves the actual points scored back compared to where the expected points scored was. Wisconsin doesn't commit that many false starts or personal fouls. They don't sabotage themselves like that. So I'm taking Wisconsin to cover, and I'm taking them to win 20-17. Thank you all so much for watching. Remember to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment your thoughts down below. Thanks to Crash2488, Brasco Rascal, and Connor Little OH for being Heisman members. Thanks to Chris Lane, Ismar, and Tyler Nye for being All-American members. And thanks to John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Sale, Austin Christmas, Judge Jorgensen, and Will Loftus for being all conference members. Have a great day, everyone. Make sure to check out my merchandise store, Patreon page, and Discord server via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. I will see you all soon. Go Badgers and go Cornhuskers. Go Big Red.